Hi, everyone. My name is Lily Gutierrez. I am with ADB's Office of Anti-Corruption and Integrity. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss safeguarding integrity in the COVID-19 response and recovery. This is a 75-minute webinar, so I hope you have your coffee, tea, or water ready. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Asian Development Bank, ADB, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, through the Anti-Corruption Initiative for Asia Pacific. So a couple of reminders: please turn off your cameras and mute yourselves to reduce audio interference. That will also reduce our data and bandwidth use for those participants who are having connection issues. At this point, you may also want to close other applications on your devices to minimize distractions. There are two ways for you to ask questions or share comments later. First, you may type in your questions at any time in the chat box. Second, you may also wait for the Q&A session, and you can raise your hands to be recognized. When I call on you, you may then unmute yourself and ask a question. So let's give that a try, shall we? Please raise your hand if you can hear me right now. Yeah, I'd like to see you raise hands. There you go. I see a couple of people raising hands. All right. If you're having issues, you should excellent. Yeah, excellent. So you may lower your hands now. Our program today is pretty straightforward. Our OECD colleagues will discuss public integrity and policy measures against corruption and bribery in the COVID-19 response and recovery. This will be followed by a summary and recommendations from ADB. We will have about 20 minutes for your questions, then we conclude by 3:15 p.m. Manila time. To start us off, let me introduce the head of ADB's Office of Anti-Corruption and Integrity, John Versantfort. John, do we have you with us?
Lily, I understand John is having problems with connecting to this webinar. So he requested if I can read his welcome remarks.
Yes, Chalpan, thank you.
Okay. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first webinar for the member countries and jurisdictions of the Anti-Corruption Initiative for Asia Pacific and observer countries. Today we have Australia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Cambodia, Georgia, Hong Kong, China, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyz Republic, Macau, China, Malaysia, Mongolia, Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, Philippines, Solomon Islands, Thailand, Vanuatu, and Viet Nam registered and are joining the webinar. A warm welcome also to the participants from the Philippine Commission on Audit, colleagues from OECD, ADB, and Transparency International, UNDP, World Bank, American Bar Association, and German Technical Cooperation Agency. The Secretariat of the Anti-Corruption Initiative for Asia and Pacific is grateful for your participation at this webinar, which we believe is timely and relevant, especially during these challenging times. For those who are unfamiliar with the Asian Development Bank, it is a multilateral development bank established in 1966 and is committed to achieving a prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable Asia and the Pacific, while sustaining its efforts to eradicate extreme poverty. ADB is owned by 68 member countries, including 49 from the region. Strengthening governance and institutional capacity, including supporting government's efforts in eradicating corruption and strengthening anti-money laundering activities, are one of the ADB's Strategy 2037 operational priorities. May I also briefly say a few words about the Anti-Corruption Initiative for Asia and the Pacific. The initiative was established by ADB and OECD in 1999 to support countries' efforts in the fight against corruption. To date, we have 32 member countries and jurisdictions and would like to extend our congratulations to Azerbaijan for joining the initiative recently. We expect one more country joining the initiative very soon. This is one of the largest networks in of the anti-corruption and law enforcement agencies in the region. Dear participants, 2020 will be marked as the year that brought one of the big pandemic emergencies in the last century that changed the lives of every nation in the world. As of mid-July, according to Johns Hopkins University and Medicine, we have more than 14 million cases confirmed with COVID-19 infection and more than 600,000 deaths worldwide. All affected countries are mobilizing resources internally and externally to combat this deadly pandemic. ADB was one of the first development partners to quickly respond and deploy assistance to its developing member countries to counter the impact of COVID-19 and address critical challenges. ADB is allocating more than $24 billion to save life and ensure economies of the region rebound quickly. As of mid-July, ADB has already allocated more than $11 billion to its 41 member countries in Asia Pacific. The following short video will show what type of assistance ADB provides to its member countries in response to COVID-19 pandemic.
From the very outset of the COVID-19 outbreak, we at the Asian Development Bank have been quick and flexible in our response to meet our members' needs. Our $20 billion assistance package for those worst affected is helping Asia and the Pacific save lives and ensure economies rebound as swiftly as possible. We are delivering grants for emergency food programs and medical needs like personal protective equipment, test kits, and laboratories. And we're providing our developing members much needed budget support on affordable terms. Our ongoing economic analysis is enabling policymakers to better plan for recovery. By providing trade and supply chain finance, we are delivering crucial support for economic growth. Wage support schemes for low-wage workers are helping smaller firms stay in business and prevent job losses. Our cash transfer schemes and other social protection measures target poor and vulnerable groups and households, as well as women and girls. Coordination with international financial institutions, the WHO and UN agencies, and development organizations help ensure that we are effective and efficient. And we remain committed to supporting our members on their path to sustainable development through projects and programs that go beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. We are doing what we have always done throughout our history spanning over 50 years. We are on the side of our developing members in their moment of need to help them pave the way for a better, brighter future.
I'm sure many countries are allocating vast amounts of resources to fight the devastating consequences of the pandemic on economies, lives, and well-being of the population. However, we have to remember that public integrity is a key to ensure that all of these response and recovery efforts reach the real beneficiaries. In today's webinar, on safeguarding integrity in the COVID-19 response and recovery, OECD will present the recommendations from its recently published policy papers on how governments and development partners should ensure that responses and efforts towards recovery from the crisis are effective and not undermined by corruption and bribery. The policy papers will provide the key integrity challenges and recommend short-term and long-term anti-corruption measures to safeguard and strengthen public procurement, accountability, and oversight, integrity in public organizations, law enforcement, and business ethics. Before we proceed with the presentation, let me introduce you to our speakers. Jeroen Michels is currently policy analyst of the Public Sector Integrity Division at the OECD. Jeroen has almost 20 years of extensive experience in the areas of good governance, public administration reform, integrity and accountability, international cooperation and program management, having worked with various multilateral agencies and institutions such as International Anti-Corruption Academy in Austria, UNICEF Viet Nam, Belgian Development Agency, and UNESCO France. For 3 years now, Jeroen has been actively managing the Anti-Corruption Initiative for Asia Pacific together with ADB as a member of the Secretariat. He holds a postgraduate degree in economics and management and a master's degree in sociology and has numerous lists of publications and articles under his name. Paul Whitaker has more than 20 years of experience in law enforcement and white-collar crime, including foreign bribery-related investigations. In the Anti-Corruption Division at the OECD, Paul is working on country evaluations under the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, monitoring mechanisms, and the impact of the COVID crisis related to foreign bribery. Paul's previous role was a senior manager in the Enforcement Division at the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, Australia's corporate regulator, where he was managing a multidisciplinary team of lawyers, investigators, and accountants investigating corporate crime, including foreign bribery-related matters. Paul has previously worked at the Australian Attorney General's Department, assisting Pacific Island countries develop anti-money laundering regimes, and the International Criminal Court in The Hague and at the Serious Fraud Office in the UK. And now, let me invite Jeroen to share the integrity challenges and policy recommendations for public integrity of COVID-19 response and recovery. Jeroen, please.
Thank you, Chopon. Good morning from Paris. Good afternoon to everyone. Thanks a lot for giving us the opportunity to present our findings and insights of our latest policy paper related to public integrity in the COVID response and recovery. So before we go into the specific risk areas, I just want to mention maybe two things. So on top of the health crisis, we can see that the COVID-19 crisis has been a stress test for governments and public institutions. So when we mean stress test, we want to say that on the one hand, we see that there is a need to make a lot of decisions very quickly in response to the pandemic in terms of public procurement, in terms of identifying and implementing social benefit packages, support to companies, etc. So all these decisions need to be made quickly. At the same time, we see that there is a disruption in the government functioning, partly due to the lockdown and the teleworking, which maybe makes access to information a bit more difficult. We've seen that some parliamentary oversight committees have been suspended. So we see that there is kind of a disruption on the government side at the same time, which kind of lowers some of the controls and oversight mechanisms that should be in place. So this is one element that kind of facilitates the integrity risks. And another one, before we start, that I want to mention that you're all aware of is economic effects of the lockdown. that we had in many countries, that you can see many companies are struggling with cash flow issues. There's risk of bankruptcy, and also many citizens are struggling. Poverty is rising, unemployment is rising. There's financial insecurities. Also, this pushes some of the integrity risks. So against this backdrop, against this situation, we can see increased integrity risks in mainly 3 areas, and these are the areas I would like to discuss with you today. So the first one is public procurement and emergency procurement. The second one is then the risks related to the identification and implementation of economic benefit packages. And the third one is increased fraud risk within public institutions. Next slide, please. So the first topic of public procurement. So what are the issues here? As I mentioned in the introduction, urgent needs to procure goods and services. And at the same time, we see that different governments have the same needs across the globe. So basically, we see a global competition emerging for specific medical supplies, for specific goods, and the bargaining power has reversed, where you usually see a government working with different suppliers. Now you basically see many governments competing for the products of one or a few suppliers. So the bargaining power has shifted, and also the prices have been very volatile. And so we see that in many cases, government procurement has happened with direct awards, with lots of exceptions to the procedure, and sometimes even with no legal framework at hand. And this opens the door for bribery, for corruption. And then the third element is that all the ongoing public contracts still need to be managed. And this in a situation where on the business side, it's not business as usual. As I mentioned, many companies face cash flow issues. So maybe they want to have faster payments. Maybe they cannot deliver the goods along the timeline that was agreed. So there we see a renegotiation of some of the elements of the public contracts, and also this renegotiation, this gives opportunity for increased bribery and corruption. Next slide, please. So then what can governments do? We identified some short-term responses and then some longer-term responses. So in the short term, it's important that all public procurement processes are being documented, and that the decision-making process is being documented, even when the time span is very short, that there is sufficient documentation so the process can be audited later on. A second good response that we found is to activate framework agreements that many governments have in place, because this provides a legal basis to procure goods and services with suppliers that have been pre-selected. A third good practice, so to say, is to produce guidelines for emergency procurement. We've seen that in Japan, for example, with guidelines for procurement for local governments. We've seen it in Ireland, for example, with also very detailed guidelines for emergency procurement for national government, national institutions. A fourth element is openness of information, so that there is at least some degree of public oversight and scrutiny possible. And the last element I want to flag here is to track the price and to track the suppliers for specific goods. So whenever a deal needs to be concluded, at least there is an overview of who can provide the goods and services and what should be the correct price. Next slide, please. And then in terms of long-term responses, this is basically what we say, repair the roof on a sunny day, and let's hope we have many sunny days. So it's about building robust anti-corruption systems within the public procurement system. So one element is to have emergency procurement legislation that can be activated in terms of whenever a crisis shows up. Second long-term response that we've seen is very effective is to use e-procurement for any purchases made by the government, because this at the same hand speeds up the process and it keeps record of all the information related to the bidding and the decision making. A fourth element is to allow auditors or to enable access of auditors to public procurement records. Often auditors work in different institutions and they are used to on-site visits, etc. Within the COVID context, this is maybe not longer possible. So therefore, remote access would certainly be helpful. And then the last one, it may seem obvious, but it has been really an issue in many countries in the OECD, is to have a number of trained public officials who are familiar with emergency procurement legislation and procedures. So that whenever there is an emergency situation, these people can really take responsibility in procurement procedures, and there's no time lost in training them or training them on the legislation. Next slide, please. So this was public procurement. Now we move to the economic stimulus packages. What do we see there? There's a lot of money being spent by governments to help companies and citizens, and this opens the door to undue influence and lobbying. Many decisions have to be made related to which companies will be supported, which sectors will be supported, what are the modalities of the support. Are we talking about tax reduction? Are we talking about loans, subsidies? What are the conditions? What is the duration of the support? What is the size of the support? And so whenever a sector or a company has direct access to the government or decision makers, they will use this opportunity now to activate that access and to make sure that they become also a beneficiary of some of these packages. So the problem is not per se that these companies and sectors have access through to the government, but that the access is uneven and that that some companies or sectors would have an advantage over others. The second element is the spending pressure. Because of the vast amount of money that have to go through the system, not always are the controls also strengthened in the same proportion. So we see that a lot of money goes through the system with lower controls, and this creates a high risk environment. And then a third point that I already mentioned in the introduction, disruption in accountability and oversight. So we see that lots of supreme audit institutions had to adapt their work plan, had to postpone audits, that the tax administrators had to delay controls, parliamentary oversight committees have been suspended. So on the accountability and oversight side, lots of things have been disrupted, which creates more opportunity to abuse power and to commit corruption. Next slide, please. So again, here, some of the short-term responses. Some countries have issued ethical frameworks for decision-making in terms of crisis, with specific clauses and specific guidance related to conflict of interest, to make sure that the decision makers and the industries or the private sector representatives that they can consult each other, but that there is no undue influence at the time of the decision making. For companies that have lobbying regulations, it is very useful these days to raise awareness on them and to strengthen their implementation. A third element is similar to the public procurement, to document decision-making processes. So at least maybe later on a parliamentary oversight committee or a Supreme Audit institution can look into the decision-making process and check if there was any wrongdoing. And a fourth short-term response, like we've seen, for example, in the US, is to create specific oversight bodies related to the spending in the framework of the COVID-19 response and recovery. So the US, for example, has the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee established that will look into all the government spending related to the pandemic. And then let's move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Longer term responses, again, this is building strong anti-corruption systems within public administration, but also beyond, in the sense that we call for framework for interactions with the private sector and for lobbying frameworks. Second one related to conflict of interest that I already covered, procedures for urgent decision making, because we see that some countries don't have, they may have legislation for emergency procurement, but there are no procedures in place for urgent decision making related to socioeconomic benefit packages or all these measures. So quite a few countries had to kind of invent or agree very urgently on decision making processes, and these processes were not tested and there were many hiccups there. So it's good to establish these procedures way in advance. Another response that's very useful is to allocate sufficient resources for Supreme Audit institutions and internal audit functions together with these packages. And we've seen actually also in the US that the Government Accountability Office received increased budget because of the increased spending. So it's good that these things are in par, and that the auditors have enough resources to fulfill their mandate. And then last but not least, to rely heavily on e-governance, both for implementation of public policies and also for oversight. So on the one hand, e-governance allows to speed up some processes and payments, and then also allows to have increased oversight for auditing and control purposes later on. Next slide, please. All right, this is the last integrity risk area that we wanted to cover, that I wanted to cover today. It relates to integrity violations within the public sector. And there we see increased integrity challenges because, as I mentioned earlier, financial pressure on some of the employees, on some companies with unemployment, etc. We see increased opportunity because of the vast amount of sums that are shifted through the system with often lower controls. And we see also, and this is kind of the behavioral aspect, mechanisms of rationalization. So this is the way you have to justify for yourself that any wrongdoing is kind of acceptable for yourself. So things like, if I don't take the money, someone else will do it, or everyone is taking the money, so I should do it as well. And we see that this combination is a fruitful ground for corruption and fraud within public sector organizations. So in terms of responses, again, there we see in general the need to build robust anti-fraud, anti-corruption systems within the public sector, and here with a strong focus on risk management, control, and audit, to establish strong organizational integrity frameworks with code of conduct, with reporting line, with whistleblowing, etc. Digitalization to document all transfers and allow accountability. And then also, last but not least, financial aid programs for colleagues that are in need in terms of maybe small loans or some form of aid that, at least on the financial pressure side, things are alleviated. So I will stop here and turn now to my colleague Paul for the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeroen, and thank you to Cholpan and the ADB for the introduction and the opportunity to present on the OECD's policy measures to avoid corruption and bribery. That was published on the OECD website back in May and is available. If you want to look, there'll be a link at the end of this presentation to that document. And the focus of that brief was to help policymakers, donor agencies, but importantly law enforcement officials and the private sector to ensure that the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic was not undermined by corruption and bribery. And as we're all aware, in March and April this year, many countries around the world started to impose lockdowns to contain the spread of COVID-19. And that's had a big impact, particularly on the functioning of law enforcement or anti-corruption agencies in many countries. The need to deal with the global health emergency was also obvious, but also highlighted lack of procurement measures, as Jeroen has mentioned, and other essential medical supplies, for example, ventilators. The economic impact of the lockdown also soon became apparent, and we saw in the video this morning the response from the ADB. And it was reported last week that South Korea went into recession for the first time in nearly 20 years because of COVID. And Australia has also recently announced its biggest budget deficit since the Second World War. So we're talking about a massive economic impact here in relation to this crisis. And I think, as Jeroen has also mentioned, the risks here are not imaginary, and more cases are being reported, particularly of domestic corruption, not so much foreign bribery at this stage. Those cases undoubtedly will come to light in due course. I just wanted to give one example of a media report, an Australian company which allegedly was in a position to supply $38 million worth of COVID-19 testing kits to Puerto Rico. The Australian company had no previous experience in manufacturing this type of materials. And there was a whole string of intermediaries used in the United States, again with no experience in this chain of supplying medical supplies or medical equipment. The company in Australia didn't have regulatory approval from the Australian authorities, even though it claimed it had. And the Puerto Rican government also was apparently using a building construction company to source these testing kits. So it just shows or highlights some of the issues that are involved here. The company also was allegedly trying to supply the Australian government with testing kits as well. Maybe if we could just move on to the next slide. So there were 5 policy measures which are there on the screen, which were highlighted in our policy brief. I'm going to deal briefly with the first one, the 4th one, and primarily the 5th one. Jeroen, as you've already heard, has really addressed 2 and 3 in relation to that policy brief. Next slide, please. So the first thing, which is key really for an effective recovery and maintaining integrity, is respecting the rule of law, international anti-corruption standards and anti-bribery obligations. Many international and regional organisations have called for this already, and proper oversight of some of the economic measures. For example, the OECD Working Group on Bribery in April issued a joint statement reaffirming its collective commitment to fight foreign bribery under the Anti-Bribery Convention, and noticed that the high risk of corruption poses a major challenge to tackling this crisis. Civil society, including Transparency International and Human Rights Watch, wrote a public letter to the Executive Board of the IMF requesting transparency and anti-corruption measures in COVID-19 related emergency relief programs, and the IMF consequently published a fact sheet on such measures. Now, one of the key things here also, and it's a principle of the Anti-Bribery Convention, but others, is that investigations and prosecutions should not be influenced by national economic interests, relations with other states, or the identity of the legal or natural person allegedly involved. So the independence of investigations and prosecutors is crucial in this recovery, and that those that are seen to be abusing their positions are not given a free pass. The next slide, please. So just as Jeroen has really highlighted in relation to some of the public institutions involved, and business ethics, internal controls and compliance are key in relation to that. That also applies as well to the private sector. And to an extent, there's a bit of a two-way street here in terms of it's often the private sector that is supplying the goods or the services to the public sectors. And it's really key that the private sector maintains good corporate governance and internal controls. Again, as Jeroen has mentioned, often when there's an economic crisis and some of these firms are struggling to survive, some of the first things that are cut back are governance issues or internal controls, and it's absolutely essential that these are maintained in this times of crisis. What we're also seeing is the use of business intermediaries. Lots of companies are trying to re-establish themselves either in their existing markets or in new markets or with new products. And the use of intermediaries really needs to be carefully considered, and appropriate risk-based due diligence measures must be undertaken before the use of new intermediaries. In the example I gave at the beginning, intermediaries with no experience in importing, exporting of medical equipment were allegedly used in that case. And it's really key that these things are considered carefully. One of the things that's also been heightened, or the dangers of, is illicit trade, particularly in counterfeit pharmaceutical products, which we already know is a massive issue. Back in March of this year, the OECD and the European Union Intellectual Property Office issued a report in relation to counterfeit pharmaceutical products. I think 4 billion euros was the scale of that yearly back in 2016 for the latest figures there. So it's a real issue, obviously, in the current crisis, and the impact that has on the health and well-being of people who are subject to or consuming those counterfeit pharmaceutical products. In relation to the illicit trade in wildlife and wildlife trafficking, as we'll be aware, some scientists are claiming that the smuggling of pangolins in Southeast Asia could actually have been one of the triggers for the current COVID-19 pandemic. And last Thursday, Viet Nam announced that it had suspended all imports of wild animal species and vowed to eliminate illegal markets across the country. And the order interestingly stated that all citizens, and especially officials, must not participate in illegal poaching, buying, selling and transporting of illegal wildlife. So again, these areas are key in terms of investigation and following up. And the last slide, if we can just move on to that, really the enforcement of corruption and bribery cases. So it's key to monitor the known risk areas and then identify emerging ones during this pandemic. So the known risk areas from the evidence that the OECD has collated over many years of looking at foreign bribery is that 1/3 of all foreign bribery cases arose in key sectors which are crucial for the COVID-19 response and recovery. So that's mainly in the health sector, transport and storage, but also in information and communications. And as we all know, we're doing this webinar remotely, so information and communications are becoming more and more part of everyday lives. In addition, the OECD report found that nearly half of all foreign bribery cases related to transactions with key foreign public officials, so those mainly in state-owned enterprises, customs officials and health officials made up those half of nearly all cases. So again, it's pretty obvious they're key individuals which are responsible for the response to the COVID crisis. There's also new risks. We're seeing an increasing use of state-owned enterprises in response to this pandemic, and lots of companies are now dealing with government officials for the first time, and there needs to be awareness there of the proper processes and procedures to follow. Whistleblowers are critical and must be protected in relation to lots of the issues that have arisen. They've come through whistleblower reports, particularly in relation to the lack of protective equipment in response to this crisis, and together with reporting by journalists. We've already seen that they're under threat as well, both whistleblowers and journalists, and reports have emerged about attempts to silence early warnings by health workers and journalists in this crisis. And according to the International Press Institute, almost 1/3 of monitored press freedom violations involve the arrest, detention or charging of journalists reporting on the pandemic. Another issue for whistleblowers, as Jeroen has also mentioned, in terms of the economic crisis, people may be more afraid to blow the whistle, as it were, in this current economic crisis, with the fear of losing their jobs and potentially not being able to be re-employed. So protection is crucial. And then just lastly, really in relation to the resources for investigative agencies and anti-corruption agencies, these resources must be protected to effect the effective detection, investigation and prosecution of these cases. They're already notoriously difficult to investigate and prosecute, often with severe delays involved in obtaining the evidence, particularly if evidence from overseas needs to be obtained. So it's crucial that these resources are maintained. Lots of countries have strict time limits for conducting investigations, and again, these delays of collating evidence, etc., securing evidence, as Jeroen has mentioned, it's important that in the procurement process, documentation is retained, that it's crucial that all these measures are implemented to ensure effective investigations going forward. And I think probably just finally, in relation to sharing of best practices, and this is where the OECD potentially and ADB could help, sharing best practices amongst countries as to how they've dealt with particularly the lockdowns and the delays, because as we're seeing already, there seems to be a second wave occurring in some countries, and we may have to live with this pandemic for many months or years to come. So those learnings would also help in terms of potentially another global crisis. So I've run out of time, I'm sorry, and I'll now hand over to Cholpan for the ADB's reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul and Jeroen, for sharing the key challenges and public integrity measures that can help policymakers, anti-corruption agencies, and international financial institutions to ensure that the COVID-19 response is protected from corruption and bribery. To summarize the presentation, I'd like to highlight the following key integrity risks. First, emergency procurement of large quantity of goods and services leads to increased risk of fraud and corruption. Lack of stockpile of the emergency supplies results in reverse competition and shift in corruption schemes. Derogations in management of the ongoing public contracts in emergency situations opens doors to corrupt practices. Relaxing accountability, oversight, and controls to urgently disbursed funds poses a high risk to effective use of resources. Key short-term policy measures to prevent fraud and corruption are focused on keeping and maintaining all records of emergency procurement and transactions, ensuring transparency and access to procurement and disbursement activities, developing necessary guidelines for emergency procurement and other accountability processes. At the same time, the main long-term measures include improving emergency procurement and internal control regulations, investing in digitalization, open data platform, and remote access to documentation and records, ensuring that investigators and auditors remain independent and have resources to continue their important work. However, the most important recommendations remain the same. We need to assess corruption risks and develop appropriate mitigation and prevention measures. We have to respect the rule of law, national anti-corruption legislations, and international anti-corruption standards. And we must strengthen accountability, transparency, and oversight. Given that most of the initiative focal points are from anti-corruption or law enforcement agencies, we would like to encourage these agencies to support their procuring and contracting authorities in this difficult time by making them aware about corruption and fraud risks and empowering them with necessary knowledge and skills to identify and prevent potential integrity violations. We are aware that several anti-corruption and procurement agencies in Asia and the Pacific were successful in helping governments to manage emergency procurement, economic and social safety programs. It would be useful if these countries share their knowledge and good practice with other less experienced countries to ensure that emergency assistance is not undermined by corruption and other illicit activities. We, at the Secretariat of Anti-Corruption Initiative, can assist in facilitating and coordinating the sharing of best practices. Please let us also know how else the Secretariat can help the countries in safeguarding integrity in the COVID response and recovery. We believe that the policy measures presented at today's webinar are also relevant to ADB operations, as emergency projects are prone to fraud and corruption. We encourage our colleagues in ADB, in regional departments and procurement to properly assess integrity risks associated with the emergency project. The policy recommendations presented today will also help ADB to identify adequate risk mitigating measures. Our Office of Anti-Corruption and Integrity can help to assess integrity risks, develop relevant mitigating measures, and provide anti-corruption awareness raising and capacity development activities for ADB borrowers. With this short summary of the presentation and recommendations, I'd like to move now to the next item in our program and requesting Lily to open the questions and answers session.
Thank you. Thank you, Chalpan. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now open for questions. Thank you for those who have sent in questions during their presentations. Please continue to type in your questions in the chat box. You may also raise a hand, and when I call on you, you may then unmute yourself and ask a question. Let me start with our first question here to Jeroen. What country, a member of the initiative, has successfully addressed integrity challenges in public procurement and oversight during the COVID-19 crisis? Please share what measures that country has taken to prevent fraud and corruption.
Thank you, Lily. Well, there are quite a few good examples out there. If I may have to pick a few, I can maybe share some perspective of Korea on public procurement. So South Korea has, as you know, already a very strong e-procurement system in place, the KONEPS, the Korea Online e-procurement system. which is hosted and managed by the Public Procurement Service. So this platform, as a starting point, was a solid basis to allow then some emergency procurement measures, which then also the Public Procurement Service has taken. And these emergency procurement measures include fast tracking and simplification of some of the procedures to buy medical supplies, to buy tablets for schools, to allow online education, and also to allow, another measure by the Public Procurement Service is to conduct fast payments. So upon the reception of goods, 4 hours after, the company received already the funds, whereas before the payment was taking a bit longer. But as I mentioned, cash flow issues with companies are critical, so it's important that the government pays in time. And then another element that Korea has done in terms of public procurement, it has helped its suppliers for medical test kits, for example, to participate in global markets. So it has really been very active in promoting the role of Korean companies and making sure that they have access to global procurement, global tenders, and they played kind of a catalyst role, a facilitator's role there. Another example that I already mentioned was Japan with guidelines for public procurement at the local level, specifically directed to the COVID-19 response. There's a good example from New Zealand when we talk about the oversight. So New Zealand has established a bipartisan parliamentary oversight committee that has the mandate to provide oversight, to look into the government response to COVID-19, including the economic stimulus packages. And the meetings of that committee can be followed online. So also there's this issue of transparency. And maybe a last example, because I've been talking already too much, is Indonesia, that has taken some lessons from what happened in the response to the 2004 tsunami and earthquake crisis in Aceh, basically in terms of aid programs to reduce opportunities for fraud and to maintain kind of the rule of law there very strictly. So in terms of fraud risk prevention, many things have been done in Indonesia as well. So I'll stop here, but there are quite a few more examples. I'd be happy to hear from the members and participants what practices they could share. I think that would also be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeroen. Just give me a second. All right, we have another question here. This one is for Paul. Could you share how a procuring entity can prevent a purchase of counterfeit pharmaceutical products and medical supplies?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's difficult, just in terms of the scale of the problem that we're involved in here. I mean, I think the main thing there is doing sufficient due diligence, which obviously isn't always easy in this environment, but using existing market intelligence to inform decisions on emergency purchases or procurement. The due diligence really is the key aspect here. Where possible, using trusted suppliers that have already been used, or contractors, and really trying to limit as much as possible the direct purchasing of goods as opposed to using the normal tendering processes. But again, that's obviously not always easy. Seeking certification or verification that the goods are genuine, again, not always easy. I've seen examples where sort of procuring agencies have been requesting photographs of the material that's to be sent. Of course, that may not be the same as the material that's actually delivered, but really it's a question of trying to the circumstances as best possible. Use what measures you can to do that. But again, coming back to a lot of these problems, you know, increasing the risk of detection and prosecution and reporting of these matters is also quite key if agencies are being sent fake products, etc. So yeah, it's really due diligence, a risk-based approach to finding the suppliers for those products.
Thank you, Paul. We have one question from Adoracion Agbada. Is there any available country experience that used new technological solutions to better promote effective management and efficient disbursement of crucial financial resources during this COVID-19 crisis to ensure that those in need receive the designated resources, thereby preventing corruption and fraud? So any available country experience that used a new technology to promote efficiency and discourage corruption and fraud? I guess that's a question posed to both Jeroen and Paul. And
well, I think it's indeed a very good point. The digitalization, we mentioned that related to public procurement and also to implementation of economic stimulus packages. We see that countries that have already digitalization implemented have used this more intensively. I'm thinking about Sweden, Germany, Finland, some of the countries there. I'm not aware of any country that has kind of started new tools for disbursement, because maybe the time frame was not well maintained. But when we talk about innovation and digitalization, many OECD countries have used this basically to identify beneficiaries for payment processes, and also in working with tax. So some of the measures involve tax reductions. So also some tax authorities have used their digital systems to make that possible. And then when we look into fraud risk management, we see increasingly the use of data analytics within anti-corruption agencies and audit offices to kind of compare databases, to find outliers, to find exceptional patterns that could indicate fraud or corruption. So I would say the use of data analytics is certainly some element in terms of corruption prevention, but also detection that is increasingly used by OECD countries.
thanks for you.
Yeah, maybe if I could just add as well, it's not an example of better solutions, but maybe it's an example of not having those solutions in place. But it was reported in the US in relation to, I think, the funds that were being distributed there, that I think there was over 3 to 5 million payments that were made to people who were now deceased in the US because of lack of access to technological management systems, etc. So it highlights where the technology is lacking, that the disbursement of those funds can become a real problem. So I just sort of provide that as an example.
Maybe just to add to this, what we've seen, and this is not only for the anti-corruption space and law enforcement space, but that the COVID crisis has been a facilitator for digitalization. We see that, I mean, you all know many governments have relied on teleworking. We've seen the need to allow access to records by auditors, by controllers. So a lot of governments are taking this COVID crisis to speed up the digitalization processes, and I think this can also be done in the anti-corruption, integrity, and risk management space. The OECD has published policy papers on digitalization more broadly, so for basically lots of policy areas at the OECD website. So you'll find more information there as well.
And also, I'll just add on top of Jeroen's point, in terms of that digitalization that we're seeing, the legal process and the courts and the collation of evidence also transitioning pretty quickly into the digital world. There are issues in terms of interviewing suspects or collating some evidence, but we're seeing more and more in countries now that digital court proceedings are taking place. So that's an interesting development which has come out of this, and is something which I think can only be welcomed.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jeroen. I just received feedback that some participants are having difficulty in typing a question on Zoom. I'm actually having issues as well typing into the chat box. So if somebody would, if you want to ask a question, you can raise a hand and I will, we will unmute you. I did get one question here. What can OECD recommend on how ADB can help its borrowing countries to protect emergency assistance from fraud and corruption? Any thoughts on how OECD, any recommendations on how ADB can help its borrowing countries?
I think on the one hand, maybe just two quick thoughts. I think on the one hand, OECD can partner with any of the countries of the initiative to strengthen indeed all the systems that we've talked about related to law enforcement, risk management, public integrity. And we could also, and then the second thing, we can also be a partner of ADB in some of their fraud risk management related to the financial support that they're offering. So OECD has increasingly moved into technical assistance and training and really tangible solutions for risk management and anti-corruption. So feel free to drop us a line and we can explore in more detail how we can support you, and we have an open discussion with ADB also to see how we can be partners in this. So yeah, the OECD is not just there for the global standards and the good practices, but we do increasingly provide kind of tailored support to countries and institutions.
Yeah, and I'd also just encourage people to, particularly in the law enforcement space, to get involved in the law enforcement network that's run with the OECD and the ADB under the initiative, and that's a good opportunity to share experiences, but also share problems and have connections at an international level. So those networks are absolutely key to fighting corruption generally, but even more so in this current crisis. So I'd encourage those to get involved in those networks and develop those contacts.
Thank you, Paul and Jeroen. Anybody have a question? I do not see any hands raised. So I'm hoping that you can just type in your questions in the chat box. Let me see. All right. If we don't have any other questions, I'll give you a couple more minutes. Feel free to interrupt me. So before we conclude, let me ask our speakers a final question. Please answer within 60 seconds or maybe 90 seconds, a minute and a half. So Jeroen, what would you like for our audience to take away from today's discussion?
Okay, so I think one of the key messages, and Chopin has also mentioned this, is to build robust anti-corruption systems before the crisis emerged. So actually, this is now the time to prepare for the next crisis that can be health related or related to other things. So it's really invest now in anti-corruption systems, in risk management, so your system is more robust whenever there's a need to make it function in exceptional circumstances. So that would be kind of the key lesson from my side. And then maybe a last thought is indeed to learn from other countries. We've seen that there are a lot of good practices out there, and it's really worthwhile sharing them, looking into how other countries are prepared for stockpiles, for procurement, for audit and control. So I would say keep sharing the lessons, and I think this initiative is certainly a good platform to do so.
Thank you, Jeroen. I just got a message that there's actually somebody raising a hand. Unfortunately, we don't have your name. You are identified as Galaxy Note 8. I had requested everybody to please make sure that we get your names so we can recognize you. Galaxy Note 8, you're raising your hand. So do you have,
Hi.
yeah, go ahead, please. Can you tell us your name?
So my name is Usita. I'm the Director of Education and Prevention Department of Anti-Corruption Unit.
Yes, thank you. Please go ahead.
From Cambodia. Yep. Very interesting presentation, and I just, as requested by Mr. Zaron, he asked about if there is, can somebody share the good practice of the country. Yes, for Cambodia, during this tough time, I mean, the government is very responsive and proactive to the outbreak of this. And then for the procurement, there is a special working group in charge of procuring works of essential goods and strategic goods. And the working group involves all the stakeholders, and by law, there is a special clause that allows a special measure during of this emergency. So this is just a short sharing of our experience. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that, Usita. Anybody with their hands raised? You can unmute yourself and speak up if we are not recognizing you. So I'm just mindful of the time. If we don't have any other questions, I don't see anything else, any hands raised. So Paul, we turn to you. What is the message you would like to highlight today for our listeners?
Well, obviously, I'd like to endorse what Jeroen has said, but also just for those that are in the investigation space, you know, there's going to be a lot of work. It requires integrity to continue with this investigation of corruption, particularly often with the people that are involved that you're investigating. It's hard work and there are undoubted challenges, but again, just to reiterate, the sharing of experiences and problems helps to get through some of those issues, and I'd encourage you to join the networks and reach out to colleagues, and particularly those in other countries, but also to the experts like the ADB and the OECD initiatives, just to understand the problems that are involved and how best to approach some of the challenges that you're facing.
Thank you for that, Paul. A couple of things, everybody. Before we conclude, do take the time to send us your feedback on today's webinar. You will find the link in the chat box. You will also be receiving an email shortly. It will have the links to both the feedback form as well as the presentations. Some of you have been asking about that. So now we'd like to request you all to help us take a photo of everyone in the webinar right now. You know, we'll just take a class picture of sorts. So may I request you to please turn on your video for a couple of minutes. Just turn on your videos and you can actually go to gallery view and you can see there should be about 49 frames per page. And all right, it's 3:15 in the afternoon. We are right on time. So on behalf of our OECD colleagues, Jeroen and Paul, and on behalf of John Versenford and his team at the ADB's Office of Anti-Corruption and Integrity, we thank you all for joining us today in discussing safeguarding integrity in the COVID-19 response and recovery. My name is Lily Gutierrez. See you at our next knowledge sharing event. Goodbye. Thank you. Maraming salamat po. Daghang salamat. See you all.